Thank you. I mean, I know we're all grateful to have heard each other. And I want to encourage those of you who have especially well-documented courses, whether it's university level or at middle or secondary school level, to share broadly. Because I think in the human rights education field, most of the resources that are available now online are mostly training materials that non-governmental organizations have pulled together for use with schools, but there's much less available that's written by teachers for teachers. And that's what we need. One of the resources that you have in your book under Curricular Resources, one of the resources is it's Rita Moran's guide. It's a collection of syllabi. It's pretty old, but it's a collection of syllabi. It's towards the back, Human Rights Syllabi for the College Classroom. And Rita Moran, who teaches at the University of California in Berkeley, and is associated with Amnesty International and another network there's another network, international, it's called International Human Rights Education Network, designed especially for university teachers who are trying to integrate human rights into what they're doing or are doing it. This is a syllabi that's being updated. So those of you at the university level who would like to share, you might consider sharing with Rita and joining something called the International Human Rights Education Network. And this is something that we can follow up with after this training. As far as I know, this is the only source available for university-level educators to go find syllabi that other people have developed. And these are very different subject areas. So it's all to say that this is very rare information that you've shared in this room today. And those of you who are at Mount St. Mary, I think it would be terrific if you could connect up with, if you're interested, connect up with other university educators and other colleges here in the U.S. and abroad, and could share your own work, please. This is I even have my own syllabi that I'm using to teach human rights education included. So those of you who are teaching head-on human rights education in teacher training colleges or would be interested to do so could use it. I think we should share good ideas. Those of you who are teaching at middle or secondary school, middle or high school, there's very little out there. I think on our website at HREA, we have the IB. There's a human rights course that's taught in the IB program, but we just don't have a lot of people offering those things. And we need to have more of those too. So maybe we have a whole section of our website on teaching human rights at the primary school and also at the secondary school level, the high school level. But again, I don't think we have a lot of syllabi. We have resources for teachers to use to figure out how to use in the classroom, but we need these examples. So please, let's continue to think about this, especially if you're going to continue to improve your own courses. I mean, let's just work together on this, because I think you have terrific experience, and I guess part of what I would love to do is to see that other people benefit from your experiences. Resources. So I mentioned that with resources. You shared the Facing History and Ourselves website, which is great. I also just wanted to call your attention to other curricular resources that were shared in your binder. HREA, our resources, you put that first as a courtesy to me, but we have an online library. It's the front section of this Curricular Resources. We have over 3,000 downloadable training materials. There's no lack of materials, but it's not designed for a social studies educator in secondary school or high school. It's not designed for a Spanish teacher in middle school. So these are more general guides. But just to let you know, there's a lot there, and it's organized by school level. It's organized by topic. You could look up children's rights. You could look up child soldiers. You could look up Darfur. I mean, I'm not sure we have a keyword search by Darfur, but we have a lot of ways for looking up information. So you might even you probably would be overwhelmed, in fact. But there's a lot there, and it's posted and shared by. It's a clearinghouse, basically. It's sort of the go-to place. But as I said, there's not a lot of curriculum per se. At the very back of the curricular section, again, in case you haven't seen it and you're looking for resources, these are, I guess, 10 resources that were vetted by Pam and STF interns. So these were vetted by the interns. These are also other really useful, practical resources for teaching human rights education. Tend to be general, everything from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to Amnesty International, Compass, which is a fabulous resource from the Council of Europe, First Steps from Amnesty, etc. Other observations. To me, I was actually really struck by how creative teachers had to be at the high school level to integrate human rights. I mean, you were doing it, but you really had to be clever about it and extremely dedicated. And I suspect also pretty much master teachers. I think it would be very difficult for a beginning teacher to be able to do what you all have done that we heard about today, excepting if you have been trained in pre-service with it, for some examples. So there it gets back to if only we had a bit more at the pre-service level. So I was actually struck by that creativity that you had. Whereas with Mount St. Mary's professors, I think you were able to really, you could just have whole courses just on the topic of human rights. So I think it is a little bit of a different challenge for middle and secondary school teachers, and I guess we know that already. I mean, that's part of the discussion tomorrow is going to be on standards and how you can work with those standards. That's why to have examples of how you do it is really, really useful. And I'm just, as I'm talking, I'm thinking out how we can use our own website to help facilitate that, because I think what I'm hearing you say is you're using resources like Facing History and Ourselves, and I'm sure all of you who are teaching human rights in your classrooms are using many different kinds of resources, and you've put it together in a way that makes sense for a certain, a certain subject, certain level of students, perhaps particular to Los Angeles in certain ways because you're bringing in the local. And that's what we need more examples of. So let me think more how we can fit. Maybe the website that you have, that you're developing, Pam, if you're going to post their lessons, we can just link to it. But we should figure that out, because we know there's some learning materials that are kind of intended to be universal, that everyone's supposed to like use and adapt, but we need these more specific applications to really figure out, okay, how can we make it really meaningful? Other observations, I think most of you were moving, you had examples from local, but also to international. That's very typical for human rights education, I think. But all of you had some element of looking at the, maybe not international relations, but practically everyone else, you were looking at local issues, and you're looking at international, so that link is really important. And most of you also had this element of taking action or activism. You used many multimedia ways of teaching, film, literature. So I don't know how typical that is for the schools or class, or Mount St. Mary's, but I was really struck by that. And I also did wonder, in terms of the examples from, I guess, from the high school level, what was sustained for students, because I'm not sure without STF, for example, if students would have maintained interest. Whereas with Mount St. Mary's, we have more of a kind of a commitment in the whole department, at least, and the prospect for more. At least academically speaking, you've got a thematic, taking up of social justice and human rights issues. But for kids in schools that don't have STF, I wonder. To me, I'm thinking out loud a little bit, because it's really clear to me, listening to you all present, this is very sophisticated teaching you're doing. And and many of you have been doing it for many years. So what I wanted to do was and I think we should do it collectively rather than individually, especially given time, is I wanted us to go back and think about, on the basis of your own presentations, and if those of you who aren't teaching, thinking about either classes you've taken in the past as best you can, or a class maybe you taught in the past, or when you might teach, try to break down a little bit on what we might be able to call human rights education competencies along these three dimensions: knowledge and understanding, attitudes and values, and skills and behavior. Because again, this gets back to what is human rights education, and I have some observations about the ways the presentation today and how I would see those categories of human rights education competencies coming out. But at the same time, I think it's really, I'm hoping it's going to be an interesting reflective exercise for us to do this, I guess, together now, since we don't have too much time. If you could just fill out, as best you can, as many as you can, the core competencies that apply to this course. And if you flip to the back side of this matrix, you can see where I'm heading with this, so no secrets. The first question is, what are the core human rights education competencies associated with the course you currently teach, in this case, or that you attended, for those of you who are still students? And then looking at these competencies after you've brainstormed individually, and then we'll talk, what might be considered minimum standards for human rights education? In other words, looking at the competencies that you generate in your seat there, and would you say these are ones that should be considered criteria for any human rights education course that's taught, or not? The third question, a little less essential, is this central only to human rights education, or would you say that whatever competencies you identify as part of your courses might apply to other courses as well that would not be necessarily HRE related? Last one's a little less essential. These are what I consider as a start, I talked to a couple other people, so it's not just me. I got a couple other people inputting on this. What I think is specific to human rights education, and you might find this in other citizenship, but I think, and so then maybe we could just go to the minimalist. See if you agree, first of all. So under knowledge and understanding, let's go down the column. History and philosophy of human rights, origins of the United Nations, and of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Maybe we should just, do we think this is, what do you think?
I think it would depend on the subject.
What I'm hearing you say, and is this useful, by the way, because it's helpful for me. So what I hear you saying is that you could see that as part of human rights education as a viable competency, but that it might not be what we consider minimal if we're working very subject specific.
Exactly.
Okay. But when you're talking about human rights in these countries, don't you have to go back?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do.
You do have to introduce some of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right?
And we do read them.
Yeah. So it's there already.
So in that context, I would see that, I would not want to see it up there on the wall if I were teaching it in the context.
So the difference is awareness versus understanding, perhaps. That's a degree. Awareness versus understanding. Okay.
Exposure or something.
Right. Good. Okay. So maybe it's a question of degree then, but we agree that it's in principle related? Okay, this is good. You're right, because awareness of is a little bit different. Even those polls they've done on there's another one that had been done as part of a research project, a Gallup poll on, no, it wasn't Gallup, but it was another national opinion agency, and they asked about awareness of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that it even existed, and then to be able to name like a couple of articles. So there are degrees. Okay. What about the next one? International human rights standards and other treaties of special relevance to learners, like could be the Convention on the Rights of the Child, rights of migrant workers. Would you say the same thing about that? That it's a question of awareness versus, yeah. So, but human rights, right? HRE part of foundation. Because I would say you, aside from the UDHR, I would consider, because of course it's my opinion, it's up here, so you know that. But I think you need to at least know that there are treaties. And there's mechanisms of protection. Okay. Arguments for and against universal human rights. Yeah. This is the problematizing human rights piece, right? A lot of you already meant universality versus regional. Okay. Again, part of it's, yeah. Okay, and then what about indivisibility of rights? You hear that a lot with the UN language. I didn't hear that.
What do you mean by indivisibility?
That you
Can't separate them from what?
that they're mutually independent. It's like a philosophical point of view. That in principle, even though they're identified and they're defined and explored individually, that you can't. In fact, sometimes, and I don't know if you'll get this, but I know somebody I know wanted to teach human rights for the first time, and they wanted to do a values clarification or exercise around human rights. Yeah, okay, thank you. Because I was like, you can't do that. You can't introduce human rights by saying, well, which do you think is more important? I mean, not the first, So let's go, knowledge and understanding, I had more. In fact, I was really struck when I was doing this, how much more I had on knowledge. That, again, that's particular to human rights, that's the point. Because I think many of the foundational skills and attitudes and behaviors that we would want to have in human rights education is also in others, like citizenship education or global education. So that's why the knowledge and understanding, I think, is a bit more for the human rights education, because they won't get it any other way. Okay, so
isn't that's what distinguishes it from apolitical studies that are more like tolerance studies and studies?
Yes, exactly.
This column over here that
especially. But I hope also these other two. But you'll see what you think, because that's the question: is it just knowledge or not? Mm-hmm. So then we got, again, see what you think. This is the human rights principles, which I introduced, but I didn't get into a lot. Now, none of you may touch on this even, but what about the idea that knowledge and understanding of human rights principles as part of, I'm missing a parentheses there, should be part of human rights education? Because most of you aren't familiar. Did any of you hear about HRBA, human rights-based approach, before today? No, you see, it's new, so it's a question. No, okay, I'm not taking it back, but I'm putting a question mark. No, it's also even an issue for the declaration that's being developed now, because there's one line. The Office of the High Commissioner they had like a 5-page document briefing the writers on it. They had one line for the human rights-based approach. A couple of us also promoted it with the committee, and it's nowhere to be found in the draft. So we have to think about that. What about this? Recognition of relationship between human rights, peace and security and development. That's a big idea. I can see how you could go much more deeper depending on, the subject you're teaching. But what I'd love to hear is also to say that, yes, even though I teach art or I teach Spanish, I can address this. If you think that you can, you should. It's more the should. Do you think we ought to consider it a human rights education competency? And what I hear teachers saying, actually, who do teach it, or who students have taken human rights courses or have human rights education infused into their courses, is that they love that connection with the international, that sense. So, anything else under knowledge and understanding that you would put up here that's not here? Think about your own teaching or learning. Oh, sorry.
I don't teach or learn, but I'm just wondering, if included in there were protections. How are human rights protected?
Yeah.
Is that in there in the mechanisms?
Yeah.
Was that what you
Yeah.
said?
Yeah.
Humility.
Yeah, but here, and if you unpack that, that includes, if you really go into it, it's not only the treaties, it's also national protection systems, because I don't want to get technical, but the idea is that if governments sign treaties, they're supposed to harmonize national laws and at all levels so that they're consistent with human rights standards. But you're right, we should be more clear about that, because that's really important. In fact, I don't think it's as clear. I think human rights mechanisms and accountability and national systems of protection, that's what they call that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're not only national, right?
No, but that's sort of the lingo used, national systems of protection, and that includes, typically that includes laws, it includes policies, actors. It helps to spell it out at the national and local level even. This idea of critical analysis of are all the human rights being respected, whether they're through laws and policies that are in place and implementation and respect for those. Yeah, I think that should be added. Thank you. I'm going to add, because it's the way I usually do it, is and national systems of protection, or national or subnational. Okay, thank you. We just have this sheet. So again, looking just for, I'm putting it human rights education competencies, because I don't know, I think I like that way of putting it. Valuing of and engagement with human rights and justice themes. Well, I guess that's pretty central. Link between rights and responsibilities. Okay. And again, if we should rephrase or add, please, caring for those suffering human rights violations, especially more vulnerable groups. I want to explain this a little bit, because I think empathy is central to human rights education. This is part of the idea of the response to violations. It's not exclusive to human rights education. I'm really trying to identify here competencies that I think are specific and to some degree exclusive to human rights education. And what is different about the way this is phrased, at least the way I'm intending it for it to be understood, is that it's seeing people suffering and seeing that suffering as a human rights violation. That's a little bit different than just seeing the suffering, if you know what I mean. It means it's a combination of an emotional response, an empathetic response, but also an analytical response in a way.
I think there's a difference between being aware of human rights and recognizing a violation.
So that would be under knowledge and understanding. Oh, that would almost be a skill, wouldn't it, to be able to recognize a human rights violation. Yeah, I think that's right. That precedes that. Yeah. Yeah. Recognition of. Good. Thank you. Recognition. Would that be? I guess that would be the recognition of human rights. What is the human rights? Recognition. Being able to recognize. I'll work on it. Okay. And that also follows from, of course, knowing what the content, but then also being able to apply it that's very central, right? Having the analytical framework. You're not just seeing suffering, but seeing human rights violations. Same principle. Thank you. What I'd like to do is just to identify competencies, because they could drive curricula. I mean, they could potentially be converted to a curricula. I mean, that would be the job of an educator. But these are not specific learner objectives. These are really competencies that have to be broken down further operationally.